Roads in the early 20th century were not welcoming to most automobiles, let alone motorcycles. Trains and horses still reigned supreme, maps were nearly non-existent, and access to fuel and oil was spotty at best. Still, none of these obstacles prevented Stearns Clancy from becoming the first person to circumnavigate the globe on a motorcycle in 1913. In this episode of On Your Bike, we take a look at the man who rode over 18,000 miles on two wheels to set a world record motorcyclists are still admiring and recreating today. Stearns Clancy was born in New Hampshire in 1890 to Alice and William Clancy. He had a curious mind and a restless soul from the start and spent days of his childhood browsing New England cemeteries in search of amusing epitaphs. He was the wayward son of a preacher and found little to be pleased with in his quiet life. In 1908, he followed his older brother George to Syracuse University, but didn't last long. He later wrote, "College seemed awfully dull." Next, he tried his hands at advertising copywriting work in New York City. He was good at it, and the bustling city had just about anything a young man could desire. But Clancy was still restless and unsatisfied. Clancy felt passion about only one thing, an undying aspiration to accomplish the longest, most difficult, and most perilous motorcycle journey ever attempted. Carl wanted to travel around the world on two wheels. It had been attempted before. 18 years prior, Frank Lenz had disappeared in a remote section of Turkey on a similar journey. And things hadn't gotten much more promising in the nearly 2 decades since. In 1912, the world lacked the infrastructure needed for long-distance auto trips of any kind, but was especially perilous for motorcyclists. Roads were generally unpaved, international communications didn't stretch past long-distance telegrams at best, and petrol stations were virtually non-existent. Despite all the obstacles in his way, Clancy was determined. He found backing for his venture from George and Thomas Henderson, brothers from Detroit, who had unveiled a 4-cylinder, 7-horsepower motorcycle, the Henderson Four. The bike's specs are laughable by today's standards, but piqued interest at the time, with Henderson claiming it to be the fastest motorcycle in the world. The 57 cubic inch engine ran 50 miles per gallon of gasoline and 170 miles per quart of oil. It had a hand-cranked starter and a foot-operated rear brake. It also boasted an elongated frame with a 65-inch wheelbase that could accommodate a passenger seat on top of the petrol tank between the driver's seat and the handlebars. The machine was met with skepticism by other manufacturers, but quickly gained a reputation for speed. But the motorcycle came with a hefty price tag of $325, about $10,000 today. In need of advertising, the Henderson brothers agreed to fund Clancy's journey in exchange for him spreading the word wherever he went. Clancy would make a $5 commission on each motorcycle order he brokered. Plus, Bicycling World and Motorcycle Review would each pay him for periodic reports from the road. The last piece of the puzzle was a companion, which Clancy found in his good friend Walter R. Story. The fact that Story had never even sat astride a motorcycle was of little concern to the always undaunted Clancy. Over the course of several months, the two men prepared for their journey. They assembled an assortment of wrenches, a first aid kit, a foldable typewriter, film and movie cameras, and a silk tent. Clancy also packed a Savage revolver for security. The pair also made plans to have tires, gasoline and oil shipped to all the areas where they were not widely available. In the early 1900s, road maps were a rarity. Most travel between cities was done by rail, not road. With guides to roads in even the world's largest cities so lacking, it's safe to assume that detailed road maps of other areas were all but non-existent. To gain access to maps and travel information, Clancy and Story joined touring clubs. Clancy carried letters of introduction from New York City Mayor William J. Gaynor and President William Howard Taft. With these aides' time, patience, and passion for his mission, Clancy cobbled together as much information on his route as was possible. Preparations completed, Clancy and Story sailed to Dublin, Ireland in 1912, where they planned to begin their ride with a tour of Clancy's ancestral homeland. In Dublin, the men collected their brand new Hendersons and set about teaching Story to ride. After a day spent practicing in Phoenix Park, Clancy was confident his friend had the ability to stay upright at least long enough to get the hang of riding on the road. He decided they were ready. Carl's confidence in his partner's riding ability may have been misplaced, however, as before they could even make it out of the city, Story's bike was hit by a double-decker tram, squashing the rear wheel and shaking the rider. It would take weeks to repair the damage, so Story clambered atop the spare seat of Clancy's bike, and the pair departed with 75 pounds of gear strapped to their single machine. The men headed inland toward Donegal, dodging cattle and sheep on the rugged terrain. Being one of the more developed countries on their list, the men managed to cruise at 20 miles per hour along the roads and suffered only a few spills. The search for petrol was often done on foot. Despite the annoyances, the breathtaking landscape and welcoming locals heartened the riders no end. Once they reached Belfast, the men sailed to Glasgow before crossing the Scottish Highlands. By this time, Story's bike had been repaired and delivered, and they now had two machines. They entered England by way of the Lake District, and in Northwich, Clancy decided to tour one of the town's rock salt mines. He and Story climbed into an iron bucket and were lowered 250 feet below ground to a vast cavern. They followed a miner's taper to a blast that left them covered in crystals and gasping for air. Emerging from the belly of the earth, Clancy and Story rode on to Chester, which they found so quaint and picturesque they were shocked they weren't charged an admission fee to enter. Wherever they went, large crowds gathered to admire their motorcycles and gawk at the men attempting to ride across the world. They spotted the future King Edward VIII in Oxford and gave an interview to Motorcycling magazine in the swanky London headquarters of the Royal Automobile Club. From there, they sailed to Rotterdam to begin their tour of the European continent. They passed through Belgian towns and countryside that would soon be destroyed by the outbreak of World War I in a few short years. They pushed on and reached Paris just before Thanksgiving and paused their travels to reassess their plans. It was undeniable that the pair had seen and experienced incredible things, but the trip was not going well. Clancy's funds were depleted, and he wasn't sure how to move forward. Unable to ride on penniless, Story decided to part ways with Clancy. Carl would go on to state that his partner had been summoned back by his employer, but other sources say Story remained in Paris to paint. Whatever his reasons, many thought Story had made the right decision. Even Clancy's parents urged him to follow his companion's lead and come home. In early 1913, Clancy secured an order for a number of Henderson cycles from a Parisian dealer. It was enough to get back on the road, and the Henderson brothers promised to pay him $500 if he reached Japan. So Clancy replaced his tires, restocked his supplies, and took to the road once more, traveling through the Loire Valley towards the Pyrenees, now on his own. Spain was more challenging than anything Clancy had encountered thus far. At the border, he was forced to pay a $50 customs fee based on the weight of his bike, around $1,500 in today's money. Spain also had the worst roads he had faced up to this point. Of riding his motorcycle in Spain at night, Clancy wrote, "One must die sometime, and to die with one's boots on is very noble. Petrol prices in Spain were quadruple the typical price he paid in New York, and his bike broke down in Figueras. It's safe to say this wasn't his favourite part of the journey. After a 3-day repair, Clancy completed his European route and headed to northern Africa, where he rode the rugged coastline between Algiers and Tunis. He was chased by a group of men on horses who fired their rifles at him, but managed to outride them and took shelter in a mountain pass. Clancy had planned to ride across China, but had to discard that notion upon learning that the roads were all but impassable. Instead, he completed most of his Asian tour riding to the island of Ceylon, which is now modern-day Sri Lanka. He bumped along jungle paths and had near-fatal brushes with water buffaloes and cheetahs. Still, he made it onward to Japan, collecting his $500 from Henderson. The country's narrow and twisting roads limited his speed, but Clancy was unbothered. He wrote that it was the most fascinating country in which to motorcycle. Everything is so different, so beautiful, so peculiar in its charms. After a slow but enjoyable tour of Japan, Clancy sailed to San Francisco, arriving in May of 1913. From there, one last tour remained, a 5,000-mile push across the United States. He was accompanied on this final leg by his friend Robert Allen, riding a new 1913 model Henderson. Somewhat surprisingly, after all the countries he had passed through, Clancy found the worst roads of his journey in his own home nation, stating that the roads near Portland, Oregon were the worst of the entire trip. Muddy and strewn with rocks, they struggled through, taking hours to travel 20 miles, with Clancy falling 17 times, damaging his bike's front forks. The pair got some respite as they toured Yellowstone Park while Clancy's bike was being repaired. 5 days later, they hit the road once more, making stops in Wisconsin to visit Clancy's brother George and his new nephew Edward, and in Massachusetts, where Clancy dropped in on his parents, finally allaying their fears. Carl was now heading into the final stretch, and in late August, he rode into New York City astride his battered and beaten, though still running, Henderson, completing the first official global journey by motorcycle. He had ridden over 18,000 miles and covered 3 continents in 11 months. It was an unimaginable feat for the time, and Clancy made headlines across the world in papers and magazines. Despite his incredible achievement and sudden fame, Clancy seemed to fade from public memory as quickly as he had entered it. The dawn of daredevil aviators, along with the outbreak of World War I, also served to bury Clancy's amazing journey. He also never wrote the book he planned on, even though he had kept meticulous notes of his journey. He told other people's stories instead, directing a number of Will Rogers movies. He enjoyed a distinguished career in Hollywood before moving to Virginia to produce documentaries for the United States Forest Service. It was there that Clancy died in 1971 at the age of 80. Following his death, his housekeeper inherited his collection of notes and photographs from his circumnavigation and passed them along to a neighborhood boy named Liam O'Connor, who was fond of visiting Clancy to hear stories about his adventures. Nearly 4 decades later, O'Connor donated all the materials, including a pair of riding boots worn during Clancy's record-setting journey, to the Smithsonian Institute at the invitation of the Clancy family. Clancy's story was largely forgotten until in 2010, when Dr. Gregory Frazier released a book about his adventures. An avid cyclist, Frazier had travelled around the world himself 5 times before getting his hands on Clancy's notes and articles from 1913. He compiled them along with context into the first complete account of the historic ride, which he titled Motorcycle Adventurer. After reading Frazier's book, 2 Irish adventurers decided to organise a global reenactment of Clancy's ride. Fergal O'Neill and Joe Walsh, in conjunction with the motorcyclist website Horizons Unlimited, executed the Clancy Centenary Ride in 2012-2013. Jeff Hill and Gary Walker recreated the ride, joined by author George Fraser, in San Francisco to complete the final leg. The modern riders had paved roads, GPS, maps, and cell phones. They passed multiple petrol stations in areas where 100 years before there were none. But the passing of a century did not change the thrill, the freedom, or the beauty of crossing the world on two wheels. Thanks for watching, and if you've a motorcycle story you'd like us to tell, let us know in the comments below. Right then, you've been told. On your bike.